we might get some resolution this week as we say hello, welcome to NFL Live from a chilly Bristol, Connecticut.
So
and
cold.
Dan and I are sitting here like, why didn't we get invited to the NFL owners meetings down in Palm Beach, Florida?
It snowed today.
Yeah, don't remind me of it, Dan. And of course, Dan here, but Mina Kimes joining us from also warm Los Angeles. We got a lot to get to today. And as we just mentioned, all about the overtime rules, because one of the biggest topics down to the owners meetings right now is the league's current OT format in the playoffs. Under this current format, 18% of regular season overtime games have ended with a team scoring a touchdown on its first drive. But in the playoffs, it's been a different story, with that number jumping up to 58%, with 7 of the 12 games being won on that first drive. So this morning, Steelers coach Mike Tomlin weighed in with his preference for the OT rules. They might surprise you.
To be quite honest with you, I'm a sudden death advocate.
Like old school.
I'm a traditionalist. I don't fear sudden death, and I never have. But obviously, I lost that battle a decade ago. But my position remains unchanged. I am one of the few sudden death advocates, I would imagine.
We mentioned how beautiful it is down in Palm Beach, Florida right now. That's where we find Adam Schefter from the NFL owners meetings. And Shefty, what will the discussion around overtime rules look like this week down there?
Well, Phil, first of all, my condolences on the chilly weather in Bristol, Connecticut. It is not that way here in West Palm Beach, Florida, where there will be discussions today and again tomorrow, a vote tomorrow on the new overtime proposals that will give each team a possession in the overtime. If we go back to 2018, we saw Patrick Mahomes not get a chance to get the football. If we go back to this postseason, we saw Josh Allen not get a chance to get the football. And I think the league is taking a look to see whether it's stars of the game, quarterbacks like Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen, each can be given a chance in overtime. There could be a vote tomorrow on a change to overtime where each team would get a possession in sudden death in the postseason, and it is expected to come to a vote tomorrow. However, it also would require 24 votes, 24 yes votes of the 32 teams, so we'll see whether or not there's enough support from NFL teams tomorrow to revamp the overtime system that has become somewhat controversial in two of the past 3 postseasons.
Yeah, ironically, Shefty, as we know, the Chiefs a couple of years ago were amongst the teams that wanted that new overtime format. It was vetoed at the time. They benefited from those overtime rules this past year. Shefty, great stuff. We'll talk to you again in just a little bit from sunny Florida. All right, so Mina, let's get to you. What do you think about these proposals? Which proposal do you most advocate for if we're going to change the overtime rules?
Yeah, well, the other one is from the Titans, who would keep the same structure, but you have to have a 2-point try to win, which, you know, coming from the team with arguably the best power running game in football, there might be a little bit of a motivation there. But the one that seems to have more momentum is the one where both teams get a possession. And Field, I think it's a good idea. You know, you hear an argument a lot, well, if you want to win, play defense, but that only requires one team to play defense. And I also think it's important to remember that in addition to being a game, in addition to factoring into competition, the NFL is also an entertainment product, and clearly fans are not completely satisfied by the current setup. I think that's reason alone to consider this change. I also think it's a change that really won't have a strong impact or change the game too much or demand too much of the players, so I'm all for it.
Yeah, Mina, you mentioned the entertainment product. I think this is about quarterbacks and the playoffs. That's because that's the conversation that we're hearing about it the most. And I think it's because there's so many great young quarterbacks in the NFL that I think it's justified to say that both teams, at least fan base wise, want to see the other team's quarterback get the ball, just because I didn't want that game to end with Buffalo and Kansas City. And then obviously the playoffs, because it's hard to sit there and watch Josh Allen play basically the best quarterback game, arguably, that any of us have ever seen, and not have a chance at the end of the game. And for everybody who says, because I've gone back and forth on this with, we'll just play defense, it's also important to point out that we are in the era that it's harder to play defense than ever before for guys.
Yes.
You can't hit quarterbacks that much anymore. You can't put hands on receivers that much anymore. And you can't hit people crossing the middle the way that they used to 20 years ago. And so I think that really kind of puts to test just the whole play the defense thing. So I don't know if the perfect answer is an 8-minute quarter and everybody has to start at 2nd and 10, so you minimize the opportunity for like really long drives. But I think both teams getting the ball is probably the smartest thing.
Dang, get Dan in the competition committee with that proposal. I actually don't mind an additional quarter, but I'll say this. You'd have to restrict it to the postseason, I think, just because you wouldn't want to ask too much more out of the players, physically. But I actually think it's fine to have different rules for the postseason. We all understand there's a clear demarcation between the regular season and the playoffs, and I would be okay coming up with a special set of rules specifically for that time.
It's crazy to think, by the way, that Josh Allen, prior to that game, had won every coin toss that he was a member of last regular season. He lost both in that game against the Chiefs, both the opening coin toss and then the overtime coin toss. Like, it's just a weird twist of fate. Let's move forward to the Chiefs. It's a little bit of a different vein, as an NFL of off-season blockbusters has continued with the Chiefs shipping 6-time Pro Bowl wide receiver Tyreek Hill to the Dolphins for 5 draft picks. The deal also makes Tyreek Hill the highest-paid wide receiver in NFL history. His now former head coach, Andy Reid, weighed in on the decision to trade away that speedy wideout.
We tried to sign. That's a sticky question because we did try to sign Tyreek at a certain cost. Once it gets past that, now you can see what we're doing here with the players we brought in, and we feel they're very good football players. So we'll see. I mean, the end result is going to be what takes place during the season, but Brett's building this thing back to where we feel comfortable so that we can go win on Sundays.
Love Andy Reid in Hawaiian shirts, but that's neither here nor there right now. Mina, let me ask you, you've had a couple of days to digest this Tyreek Hill trade. What do you make of it in terms of the Chiefs and their perspective in this deal?
Yeah. I feel like I'm kind of dressed like Andy Reid today, by the way. And listening to him, his words, I think, do explain the Chiefs' reasoning or the rationale behind a deal that a lot of, or a trade, rather, that a lot of people found puzzling at the time, specifically the focus on cost. And once we saw what Miami gave Tyreek Hill, making him arguably the highest paid wide receiver in football, to me, this tells us a few things. The Chiefs, while understanding, obviously, the incredible value Hill brings to their team, how unique he is, obviously didn't believe he was worth that kind of contract with his age and his particular skill set as a wide receiver. I suspect they think it won't age particularly well. Another thing, this is a roster that has a lot of holes, especially on defense. And I think they saw an opportunity with the trade to address some of those holes, because if they gave Hill all of that money, this would be an even more top-heavy roster than it's been. And then the third thing, Field, is something that's kind of occurred to me over the last couple of days. Patrick Mahomes is 26 years old. Right. This is not an Aaron Rodgers, Tom Brady situation where you have to be all in now and maximize the roster in the present tense. Clearly, they're thinking long-term. They're trying to extend their Super Bowl window. Now, does it mean they might be slightly worse in the short term? It's entirely possible, but I can see why they made that bet. Yeah,
I think you bring up a good point with the reality of the roster, Mina. And I think because of this trade, something to point out is they have 5 picks in the top 100 of this draft. They have 4 in the top 62. And if we look at some of the people on their team, Tyreek Hill, Mecole Hardman, Kareem Hunt, who was a Kansas City Chief, who's now a Cleveland Brown, Travis Kelce, those guys were all drafted in the 2nd round or later. This organization has a history of building really good rosters, not just on the backs of first-round picks, but 2nd and 3rd round picks. Talked about this a little bit last week. I'd love to, like the philosophical change. I think that they became so dependent on the RPO. I think they're going more towards, rather than trying to get the perfect play call, getting better execution as an offense and not being so reliant on Patrick having to be perfect every play. And I think they're going to try to go run the ball a little bit more and play drop back quarterback. And if you ask me, like, what would be the one piece that I think they need offensively, it's a Jahan Dotson from Penn State, because I think they have some speed with Mecole Hardman and MVS at wide receiver. Juju has a bigger body. Yeah. I think Dotson would give them the route runner, the finesse type of receiver that if they're going to go to that offense, they probably need to implement into it.
Every trade that takes place in the NFL is probably best judged after a couple of seasons. Sure. This feels like the poster child for such discussion, right? Because we're not going to know how good this Chiefs package is until we see some of 100%. These picks on the field. So it'll be really interesting to see how Kansas City uses its new assets. Dan, you mentioned the draft capital. They're the only team in the NFL that has multiple picks in each of the